For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire had been the world's living colossus. From the snow-capped Balkans to the dunes of Arabia, from the walls of Vienna to the gates of Yemen, its banners fluttered under one name, Devleti Aliye, the Sublime State. It ruled over 30 provinces, commanded millions, and guarded the holiest cities of Islam. But by the dawn of the 20th century, its domes still gleamed while its foundations quietly cracked. The empire that once terrified Europe was now borrowing money from it. The Sultan Caliph, once feared as the shadow of God on earth, could barely pay his soldiers. Yet in the marble corridors of Topkapi and Yildiz Palace, courtiers still toasted to victory, blind to the rust beneath the gold. How does a civilization that stretched across 3 continents fail to hear the sound of its own heartbeat fading? It began with an idea, Tanzimat, the reorganization. In 1839 and again in 1856, imperial decrees promised equality before the law, new schools, modern armies, a constitution, salvation through westernization. But reform came at a cost. To modernize its army, the Ottomans turned to British rifles and German instructors. To build railways and telegraphs, they borrowed from French banks. With every loan, a chain was forged. By 1881, the empire's debts were so large that a European-run body, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, seized control of customs revenues, effectively turning Istanbul into a client of Europe. The sultans told themselves it was progress. But how can a sovereign empire survive when its lifeblood, its finances, belongs to foreigners? Then came the uprisings. The Greek War of Independence in the 1820s was only the beginning. The Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, Bosnians, one after another, provinces rose in rebellion. Each revolt bled soldiers, treasure, and faith. The great European powers, pretending to champion liberty, secretly armed the rebels and waited like vultures for their share of the carcass. In 1877, the Russo-Turkish War delivered a devastating blow. Russian troops marched within sight of Istanbul, forcing the empire to sign the Treaty of San Stefano, stripping it of vast territories. The once mighty Caliphate now looked to Britain for protection that came with invisible shackles. When the Berlin Congress of 1878 redrew the map, the Ottomans lost almost all of the Balkans. Bosnia went to Austria-Hungary, Cyprus to Britain. The sick man of Europe was no longer an insult. It was a diagnosis. Could an empire that claimed divine favor survive when its neighbors treated it as a corpse to be divided? Inside the palaces, another war raged, not of armies, but of ideologies. Sultan Abdulhamid II, crowned in 1876, suspended the newly written constitution within 2 years, ruling through fear and faith. He built a vast spy network, censored newspapers, and tried to unite Muslims under the banner of pan-Islamism, hoping that faith could succeed where politics had failed. He built schools, railways, and the Hejaz Railway stretching from Damascus to Medina, a marvel meant to bind the Arab heartlands to Istanbul. But repression breeds rebellion. Students, officers, and exiles whispered of liberty in coffeehouses from Salonika to Cairo. They called themselves the Young Turks, a secret movement that promised to restore the constitution and save the nation through reason and nationalism. Was the Caliph's dream of unity enough to silence the storm of modern revolution building beneath his throne? By 1908, the empire was a volcano ready to erupt. In the city of Salonika, officers of the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, mutinied, demanding the return of the constitution. Their message spread like wildfire through the garrisons. No more tyranny, no more stagnation. Within weeks, the unthinkable happened. The army forced the Sultan to surrender his absolute power. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman Empire became a constitutional state. Crowds poured into the streets chanting, "Long live freedom! Long live the Constitution!" But revolutions rarely come without ghosts. A year later, counter-revolutionary forces tried to restore Abdul Hamid. The young Turks responded by deposing him entirely. The Caliph of Islam, once ruler of millions, was sent into exile, guarded by his own soldiers. Did the empire just save itself, or decapitate the last symbol holding it together? The new rulers promised rebirth, but they inherited ruins. The provinces were restless, the army divided, the treasury bankrupt. In the distant deserts of Arabia, Sharif Hussein watched with growing contempt. In the Balkans, Christian states still plotted revenge. Meanwhile, the new young Turk triumvirate, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Kemal Pasha, dreamed of rebuilding the empire through modern power and military pride. They sought new allies, and found them not in London or Paris, but in Berlin. Germany offered weapons, advisors, and railways. In return, it asked for loyalty. The Berlin to Baghdad railway was laid as both symbol and trap, tying the dying empire's future to the ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Could this alliance with Germany restore the Caliphate's lost glory, or drag it into a war it could never survive? By 1910, the Ottoman Empire was a house rebuilt over ashes. The young Turk revolution had promised rebirth, but the men who now held power, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Kemal Pasha, were not visionaries. They were gamblers playing with history. Each believed he could restore the Caliphate's greatness, not through faith, but through force. Their slogan was simple: union and progress. But the more they tried to unify, the more the empire fractured. In every province, from Damascus to the Balkans, old loyalties died. Turks, Arabs, Armenians, and Kurds, peoples once united under the crescent, now began to see themselves as separate nations. The Caliphate was turning into a prison of identities. And yet, the triumvirate believed war could heal what politics could not. Could an empire already bleeding internally survive by spilling even more blood abroad? The first test came in 1911, when Italy, hungry for colonies, invaded Tripoli in modern-day Libya. The Ottomans, stretched thin and disorganized, sent a few brave officers to resist, among them a young man named Mustafa Kemal. The Italians, armed with aircraft and modern artillery, crushed them swiftly. The loss of Libya was more than territorial. It was symbolic. The Caliphate could no longer defend even its Islamic lands from European greed. But the humiliation didn't end there. The following year, the Balkan League, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, united and struck. What followed was a catastrophe. Ottoman armies, poorly led and fragmented, were annihilated in the First Balkan War. Towns that had flown the crescent for centuries, Salonika, Monastir, Edirne, fell one after another. Refugees flooded into Anatolia by the hundreds of thousands, bringing stories of massacres and loss. In Istanbul, panic turned to rage. The young Turk leaders seized absolute power in a coup in 1913, declaring that only dictatorship could save the empire. Was this rebirth, or the final gasp of an empire that no longer knew the difference between survival and delusion? The Balkan disasters reshaped the Ottoman soul. The triumvirate concluded that weakness had come from dependence on the West. Their solution? To find a new master, one who could arm them, train them, and treat them as equals. That master would be Germany. Enver Pasha, now the Minister of War, admired the Prussian discipline and the industrial might of Kaiser Wilhelm II. German officers were invited to modernize the Ottoman army. One of them, Lyman von Sanders, became virtual commander of Ottoman forces. In Berlin, the Kaiser promised Enver that a new alliance could restore Ottoman pride and perhaps even regain its lost provinces. The deal was sealed not with words, but with steel. The Berlin to Baghdad railway, stretching thousands of kilometers through the desert, was to link German industry to Ottoman oil and Asia's markets. But beneath the iron and ambition, the empire was walking into a trap. Could an empire that once ruled the world now afford to serve another's ambition? In 1914, the world burst into flame. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo ignited the First World War, a war that would engulf every great power. The Ottomans stood at a crossroads. Britain, France, and Russia offered neutrality. Germany offered alliance and revenge. Enver Pasha, blinded by dreams of glory, chose war. Without warning, 2 German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, sailed into the Dardanelles and were gifted to the Ottomans. They were renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli, symbols of a new alliance. Within weeks, Ottoman guns, manned by German officers, shelled Russian ports in the Black Sea. On November 11, 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially entered the Great War on the side of the Central Powers. The Caliph of Islam, under pressure from the new government, declared a jihad, calling Muslims worldwide to rise against the Allies. But few answered. Was this holy war truly for Islam, or for men who had already sold the Caliphate's soul to Europe's empires? The first campaigns were disasters. In the frozen mountains of Sarıkamış, Enver Pasha led 90,000 men against Russia. He dreamed of retaking the Caucasus and reclaiming the lost lands of the empire. But he ignored winter, logistics, and God himself. Within weeks, almost 80,000 Ottoman soldiers froze or starved to death in the snow. Entire battalions vanished without firing a shot. The defeat shattered the army and the illusion of invincibility. To hide his failure, Enver blamed others, Armenians, Arabs, officers who questioned him. The seeds of paranoia began to take root. Could the empire survive a war that was already consuming its sons faster than it could bury them? But the empire's agony didn't stop there. To the south, British and French forces landed in Gallipoli in 1915, hoping to capture the Dardanelles and open a sea route to Russia. Against all odds, the Ottoman defenders, led by the same Mustafa Kemal who had survived the Libyan disaster, fought like lions. From the cliffs of Çanakkale, they rained fire upon the invaders. The sea turned red. The beaches became graveyards. After months of slaughter, the Allies withdrew, defeated. For a moment, the empire breathed again, a fleeting taste of the glory it had lost. But even victory could not stop what was coming. Inside the government, paranoia grew into cruelty. Enver and Talaat believed their empire could only survive through purity. And in that belief, one of history's darkest chapters began to unfold. Could a dying empire justify its survival by turning against its own people? The year was 1914. The Ottoman Empire, once the mighty caliphate stretching across 3 continents, now stood at a crossroads between survival and annihilation. The world was plunging into the chaos of the First World War, a conflict unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, were redrawing the map of the earth, and in the middle of this storm, the Ottomans faced a choice that would determine their very existence: neutrality or war. When Sultan Mehmed V entered the ornate halls of Topkapi Palace to discuss the empire's fate, his advisors were divided. Some urged caution, stay neutral, let the Europeans destroy each other. But others whispered a darker promise, join Germany and reclaim the empire's lost honor. The German Kaiser had promised the Ottomans protection, modern weapons, and perhaps even the restoration of old territories. And so, on November 11th, 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the Great War, believing it was a holy struggle to save Islam's last caliphate. But that decision would unleash the empire's destruction. From the burning sands of Arabia to the frozen fields of Gallipoli, Ottoman soldiers fought with unimaginable courage. At Gallipoli in 1915, a young officer named Mustafa Kemal stood before his men and uttered the words that would echo through history. "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die." And they did. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers perished defending their homeland against the Allied invasion. For a brief moment, the empire felt its old pride again. The world saw that the Turks had not forgotten how to fight. But beyond the battlefields, betrayal was already spreading like poison. The British were secretly plotting the empire's dismemberment. In the dusty tents of the Arabian desert, a British officer named T. Lawrence of Arabia, was whispering promises of freedom to Arab leaders, urging them to revolt against their Ottoman masters. With gold, weapons, and deceit, Britain turned the empire's own sons against it. Arab tribes rose in rebellion, attacking Ottoman outposts, cutting off supply lines, and paving the way for British troops to march across the Middle East. In 1916, a secret agreement sealed the empire's doom, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain and France, behind closed doors, divided the Ottoman lands between themselves long before the war even ended. Syria and Lebanon would go to France, Iraq, Palestine, and Arabia to Britain. The Caliphate, the spiritual heart of the Muslim world, had already been carved up like prey before the hunt had even begun. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, famine and disease ravaged the people. The once mighty empire could no longer feed its own citizens. The young men were dying in the trenches, and the empire's heart, Constantinople, was bleeding. The dream of uniting Muslims under one caliph was collapsing under the weight of modern warfare, betrayal, and exhaustion. By 1917, the unthinkable happened. Jerusalem fell. For the first time in centuries, the Holy City was no longer under Muslim rule. British General Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem and declared that the Crusades had been avenged. The Muslim world trembled. For over 700 years, Jerusalem had been under Islamic protection. Now, the Caliphate could only watch as one sacred city after another slipped away. And as if that humiliation wasn't enough, the British found their final weapon, the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali. In exchange for the promise of an independent Arab kingdom, he raised the flag of rebellion against the Ottomans. The Arab Revolt tore the empire apart from within. Turkish soldiers found themselves fighting not just against foreign powers, but against the very people they once called brothers. By 1918, it was over. The Great War ended, but for the Ottoman Empire there was no victory, only surrender. British and French troops marched into Constantinople, the jewel of the Caliphate. Allied warships lined the Bosphorus, their flags fluttering where once the Crescent had ruled. The centuries-old empire had collapsed into dust. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 formalized what was left: shattered provinces, divided territories, and a broken caliphate. The dream of a unified Islamic empire had died, not in battle, but through betrayal, deception, and internal decay. But from the ashes, a new fire began to rise, one that would reshape Turkey, the Middle East, and the Islamic world forever. A man named Mustafa Kemal Atatürk would rise to lead a revolution, not in the name of the Caliphate, but against it. He would fight not for the empire's restoration, but for a new, modern nation built on the ruins of the old. As the ancient banner of the Caliphate was lowered for the last time, one question lingered across the Muslim world. How did a civilization that once ruled the deserts, seas, and skies of 3 continents fall so easily to the deceit of its enemies and the weakness within? And could the flame of the Caliphate ever rise again from the shadows of history? When the guns of the Great War finally fell silent in 1918, the Ottoman Empire, once feared from Vienna to the Arabian Sea, was no longer a state, but a corpse waiting to be divided. British troops marched through the streets of Constantinople. French flags fluttered above Ottoman buildings. Allied soldiers lounged in coffee houses where sultans once held council. The centuries-old caliphate had been reduced to a mere shadow. Its ruler, Sultan Mehmed VI, a prisoner in his own palace, watching helplessly as foreign generals dictated the fate of his empire. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, was the final insult. The Allies tore the empire apart piece by piece. Greece was handed control over the western coast of Anatolia, including Izmir, Smyrna, a city that had been Ottoman for nearly 500 years. Armenia was promised independence in the east. France took Syria, Britain took Iraq and Palestine, and Italy was given claims in southern Anatolia. Even Istanbul itself was under Allied occupation. The once great heart of the Caliphate had become a puppet, its sultan nothing more than a ceremonial figurehead under foreign control. But not everyone was ready to kneel. In the mountains of Anatolia, a new movement began to rise, led by a man who had once fought in Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal Pasha. To the weary survivors of the war, he was not just a soldier. He was a savior, a man of iron discipline, vision, and resolve. In 1919, he gathered patriots in the city of Samsun and declared something revolutionary. The sovereignty belongs not to the Sultan, but to the people. It was a declaration of rebellion, not only against foreign powers, but against the very foundation of the Caliphate itself. Kemal's movement spread like wildfire. In the cities of Ankara, Erzurum, and Sivas, local assemblies pledged allegiance to the new cause, not to the Sultan, but to the Turkish nation. Villagers sold their last possessions to fund his army. Women melted jewelry to buy bullets. From the ashes of an empire, a revolution was being born. Meanwhile, the Sultan, terrified and powerless, sided with the Allies, branding Kemal and his followers as traitors. The stage was set for a war, not just between nations, but between 2 visions of Islam's future, one clinging to the dying past, and the other fighting to forge a new, secular order. By 1922, Kemal's forces had done the impossible. They drove the Greek army out of Anatolia, recaptured Izmir, and forced the Allied powers to retreat. The Treaty of Lausanne replaced the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres, recognizing the sovereignty of a new state, the Republic of Turkey. Then came the moment that would change Islamic history forever. On November 1st, 1922, the Turkish Grand National Assembly abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. The Caliphate, however, was allowed to remain, at least in name. Sultan Mehmed VI fled the empire disguised as an ordinary passenger aboard a British warship, leaving his throne and crown behind. For the first time in 623 years, there was no Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople. 2 years later, on October 29th, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was officially declared, with Ankara as its capital and Mustafa Kemal as its first president. A new era had begun, one that turned its back on the traditions of empire, religion, and monarchy. And then, the final blow came. On March 3rd, 1924, the Turkish parliament voted to abolish the Caliphate. The decision sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. The last Caliph, Abdülmecid II, was stripped of his title and exiled from Turkey. The symbol of Islamic unity, the institution that had once united millions from Morocco to Malaysia, was gone. When the news spread, the streets of Cairo, Delhi, and Damascus erupted in disbelief. Scholars and poets mourned the loss as if a great light had been extinguished. The Indian scholar Muhammad Iqbal lamented, "The Caliphate was not merely a political institution, it was the spiritual bond of the Muslim world." But Mustafa Kemal was unmoved. He believed that the Caliphate had become a relic, a tool used by colonial powers to manipulate Muslims. In its place, he built a new vision, a modern, secular Turkey, where religion would no longer rule the state. Mosques were replaced by schools, Arabic script gave way to the Latin alphabet, and the fez, the symbol of Ottoman identity, was banned. The old world had died, and in its ashes, a new one emerged, proud, modern, but spiritually fractured. For centuries, the Caliphate had been more than a government. It was the idea that the Muslim world was one body under one leadership. Its fall left a vacuum that has never been filled. From Cairo to Jakarta, Muslims still debate. Should the Caliphate be restored, or was its death inevitable, a necessary step toward a new age? The Bosphorus, once lined with Ottoman warships and caravans of pilgrims, now flows quietly past the domes of Istanbul. But beneath that stillness, one can almost hear the echoes of a vanished empire, of sultans and scholars, warriors and poets, the dream of unity that slipped away under the weight of time and ambition. The question remains, was the fall of the Caliphate the end of Islamic power, or merely the beginning of its long awakening?